Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The autumn morning arrives with its characteristic chill in Boston, Massachusetts, where Dr. Sarah Mitchell begins her day at the Historical Archives Department of the New England Heritage Institute. At 42 years old, she has dedicated the last 2 decades of her life to uncovering forgotten stories from 19th century America, specializing in the lives of domestic workers and enslaved people in the pre-Civil War era. Her office, located on the 3rd floor of a renovated Victorian building in the heart of the city, overlooks the Charles River, where golden leaves dance on the water's surface under the pale October sun. Sarah's current project involves cataloging and digitizing thousands of daguerreotypes and early photographs from Massachusetts farming families between 1840 and 1870. The work is meticulous and often monotonous, requiring her to examine each image carefully, document its contents, verify dates, and cross-reference with existing historical records. Most photographs reveal nothing more than stern-faced families posed rigidly before their homes, the long exposure times of early photography forcing them to remain motionless for minutes at a time. Yet Sarah finds profound meaning in these frozen moments, seeing beyond the surface to imagine the real lives, struggles, and dreams of people who lived more than a century and a half ago. This particular morning, she retrieves a cardboard box from the climate-controlled storage room, labeled simply as donation number 743 from the estate of Eleanor Pemberton, deceased in 2022 at age 97. Eleanor had been the last surviving member of a prominent Massachusetts family whose roots traced back to the colonial era. Her estate included numerous family documents, letters, and photographs that had been carefully preserved through generations. Sarah carefully opens the box, finding it filled with protective acid-free envelopes, each containing photographic materials in various states of preservation. The first dozen images show typical scenes: family portraits, farm buildings, horses and cattle, children in their Sunday finest. Sarah documents each one methodically, noting dates when visible, identifying subjects when possible through accompanying notes, and making observations about clothing, architecture, and agricultural equipment visible in the frames. The process requires patience and attention to detail, skills Sarah has honed over her career. She takes high-resolution scans of each photograph, creating digital files that will be accessible to researchers worldwide while protecting the fragile originals from excessive handling. The 13th photograph immediately captures her attention in a way the others have not. Unlike the stiff, formal portraits she has been reviewing, this image possesses an unusual quality of life and movement. The scene depicts the Hannon farm in western Massachusetts, according to a faded notation on the reverse side, dated August 1858. The photograph shows a substantial white farmhouse with black shutters, 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch, surrounded by well-maintained grounds. In the foreground, 3 children play near a wooden fence, their forms slightly blurred, suggesting movement during the exposure. A man, presumably the patriarch, stands beside a prize bull, his hand resting proudly on the animal's massive shoulder. A woman in a fine dress sits on the porch steps, a parasol tilted against the afternoon sun. What makes this photograph remarkable is its composition and the sense of genuine moment it captures. Unlike most photographs of the era, which feel staged and artificial, this image seems to have caught a real afternoon in the life of a prosperous farming family. The lighting is exceptional, suggesting the photographer possessed considerable skill, and the clarity of detail is superior to many daguerreotypes Sarah has examined. She can make out individual leaves on the maple tree shading part of the house, see the texture of the wooden fence rails, even discern the pattern on the woman's dress. Sarah begins her standard documentation process, but something draws her eyes repeatedly to the background of the image. Behind the main subjects, partially obscured by the shadow of the house, a figure stands near the kitchen entrance. At first glance, Sarah assumes this is simply another family member or farm worker, as such background figures were common in photographs of the period. However, as she examines the image more closely under her magnifying glass, details begin to emerge that make her pause. The figure is a young woman, possibly in her late teens or early 20s, wearing the simple dark dress and white apron characteristic of domestic servants in that era. Her posture is rigid, her hands clasped before her. Unlike the family members in the foreground who seem relaxed and natural despite the formality of being photographed, this young woman appears tense, her body language suggesting discomfort or fear. Sarah increases the magnification, leaning closer to her computer screen where the high-resolution scan displays every minute detail captured by the primitive but effective photographic technology of 1858. Then Sarah sees it. Around the young woman's neck, partially hidden by the collar of her dress but unmistakably visible in the harsh clarity of the photograph, runs a dark mark. The shadow and distance make it difficult to determine its exact nature, but its presence is undeniable. Sarah's heart rate increases as professional instinct mingles with personal emotion. She has spent her career studying the lives of people who left few traces in historical records, people whose suffering and struggles were often deliberately erased or ignored by those who documented history. This photograph, with its cheerful depiction of prosperous farm life, may contain evidence of a darker reality hidden in plain sight. Sarah spends the next hour examining every pixel of the digitized image, zooming in and out, adjusting contrast and brightness, trying to understand what she is seeing. The mark on the young woman's neck appears to be a bruise or wound of some kind, dark and irregular in shape, extending from just below her ear down toward her collarbone. The resolution of 1858 photography, while remarkable for its time, cannot provide the fine detail needed to determine the exact nature of the injury, but its presence is clear enough to be concerning. Sarah makes careful notes, screenshots specific sections of the image, and begins the process of researching the Hannon family. The Massachusetts Historical Society database provides the first leads. The Hannon family of Hampshire County were prosperous farmers who owned approximately 300 acres of prime agricultural land in the Connecticut River Valley. Thomas Hannon, age 41 in 1858, had inherited the property from his father in 1846 and had expanded the farm's operations considerably, becoming known for breeding high-quality dairy cattle and draft horses. He was married to Catherine Hannon, formerly Catherine Whitmore, daughter of a local merchant family. They had 4 children: Thomas Jr., age 15, Margaret, age 12, William, age 9, and Elizabeth, age 6. The family attended the Congregational Church in town, contributed to local charities, and by all accounts represented the model of respectable, God-fearing, hard-working New England farming stock. The census records from 1860 provide additional information. The Hannon household included the 6 family members plus 2 live-in domestic servants and 3 farm laborers who resided in quarters separate from the main house. The domestic servants are listed simply as Mary Kelly, age 20, born in Ireland, and Bridget O'Connor, age 18, also born in Ireland. The farm laborers' names are recorded, but their living arrangements suggest they had less contact with the family's daily household life. Sarah's pulse quickens as she reads these names. The young woman in the photograph could be either Mary or Bridget, both Irish immigrants who would have come to America during or shortly after the Great Famine that devastated Ireland in the 1840s. Sarah knows from her research that Irish immigrant women in the 1850s faced particular vulnerabilities. Arriving in America often with no money, no connections, and facing widespread prejudice against both their nationality and their Catholic faith, many had little choice but to accept domestic service positions under whatever terms were offered. Labor laws protecting workers did not exist. Servants worked from dawn until late evening, 7 days a week, with perhaps 1 afternoon off per month if they were fortunate. They had no recourse if mistreated, no agencies to appeal to, no legal protections against abuse. Their employers wielded almost absolute power over their lives and well-being. The realization of what she may have discovered begins to settle over Sarah with a weight that feels physical. If the mark on the young woman's neck indicates abuse or violence, this photograph represents more than a historical curiosity. It could be evidence of a crime committed more than 160 years ago, a crime that went unpunished and unrecorded, leaving only this single photographic trace. Sarah thinks of all the history that has been written about this period, all the books celebrating the industriousness and moral character of New England farming families, all the heritage tourism that presents an idealized vision of rural American life in the 19th century. How much suffering was hidden behind the facades of respectability? How many voices were silenced? Sarah makes the decision to investigate further. She contacts colleagues at other institutions, shares the image with specialists in photographic analysis, and begins the painstaking process of tracing what happened to Mary Kelly and Bridget O'Connor after 1860. The photograph, which initially appeared to be simply another pleasant family scene, has become the starting point for an investigation that will consume the next several months of Sarah's life and ultimately reveal a story that challenges comfortable narratives about American history. As the autumn afternoon fades into evening, Sarah sits in her office. The photograph displayed on her screen, the young woman's face barely visible in the shadows, but her presence suddenly demanding attention. After more than a century and a half of being overlooked, Sarah makes a promise to this unnamed woman from the past. Her story will be told, her suffering acknowledged, her existence remembered. Whatever happened on the Hannon farm in 1858 will be brought to light, not for sensationalism or judgment, but for truth and for justice, even if that justice can only take the form of historical recognition. Sarah's investigation intensifies over the following weeks as she deploys the full range of historical research methods she has mastered during her career. The photograph of the Hannon farm sits pinned to her office wall, a constant reminder of the questions demanding answers. She begins by expanding her search through Massachusetts archives, looking for any additional references to the family, the farm, or the servants who worked there. The work is slow and often frustrating, as record-keeping in the mid-19th century was inconsistent and many documents have been lost to fire, flood, neglect, or deliberate destruction over the decades. Church records provide the first significant breakthrough. The Congregational Church in the town nearest the Hannon farm maintained meticulous records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Sarah drives out to the small town on a gray November morning, the landscape bare and brown as winter approaches. The current church building dates from 1900, but the records from the original structure have been preserved in fireproof cabinets in the basement. The church secretary, a friendly woman in her 60s named Patricia, helps Sarah navigate the handwritten ledgers, their pages yellowed and fragile despite careful preservation. The burial records from 1858 and 59 contain an entry that makes Sarah's breath catch. On September 14, 1858, just 6 weeks after the photograph was taken, a funeral service was conducted for Bridget O'Connor, age 18, servant in the household of Thomas Hannon. The cause of death is listed as accidental fall resulting in injury to the neck and head. The service was brief, attended by the Hannon family and a few other local residents. Bridget was buried in the paupers section of the town cemetery, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross that has long since rotted away, leaving no visible trace of her final resting place. Sarah sits in the church basement for a long time after reading this entry, feeling the weight of confirmation settle over her. The young woman in the photograph, the one with the mark on her neck, was almost certainly Bridget O'Connor. And 6 weeks after that photograph was taken, she was dead from injuries to her neck and head, officially ruled an accident. Sarah's professional training demands that she not jump to conclusions, that she gather all available evidence before forming hypotheses, but her instincts tell her that something deeply wrong occurred on the Hannon farm in the summer and early autumn of 1858. The next step involves examining local newspaper archives. The town had a weekly newspaper that covered local events, though its coverage focused primarily on political matters, agricultural prices, and social events among the more prominent families. Sarah spends days scrolling through microfilm at the regional library, her eyes straining to read the small print of period newspapers. Most of what she finds is mundane: advertisements for farm equipment, notices of town meetings, reports on church socials and harvest celebrations. Then, in the September 21st edition of the Hampshire Valley Register, she finds a brief paragraph that offers another piece of the puzzle. The notice reports the unfortunate death of Miss Bridget O'Connor, a domestic servant employed by Mr. Thomas Hannon of this township, who expired on September 13th from injuries sustained in a fall down the cellar stairs. The article notes that Miss O'Connor, a recent immigrant from Ireland, had been in the Hannon employ for approximately 2 years and was known as a hardworking and pious young woman. The piece expresses sympathy for the Hannon family, who are described as being much distressed by the tragic accident that occurred under their roof. No further details are provided, and Sarah finds no follow-up articles or additional mentions of Bridget O'Connor in any subsequent issues. The description of the death raises immediate questions. The church records list the cause as a fall resulting in neck and head injuries. The newspaper specifies a fall down cellar stairs. Sarah knows that stairs in 1850s farmhouses were typically steep and narrow, and fatal falls were not uncommon in an era without modern safety standards. However, the mark visible on Bridget's neck in the photograph taken 6 weeks before her death suggests she was already injured or in danger at that time. Did she sustain an earlier injury that made her vulnerable to a later accident? Or does the photograph capture evidence of ongoing abuse that ultimately resulted in her death? Sarah contacts a colleague at Boston University, Dr. James Chin, who specializes in forensic history and has experience analyzing historical evidence of violence and abuse. She shares the enhanced digital images of the photograph, focusing on the marks visible on Bridget's neck. James studies the images carefully, consulting with medical experts and specialists in historical forensic analysis. His preliminary assessment, delivered during a video call, is sobering. The marks appear consistent with strangulation or choking, possibly inflicted days or weeks before the photograph was taken. The pattern suggests manual strangulation rather than ligature marks. The severity and visibility of the bruising indicates significant force was applied to the young woman's neck. This expert analysis, combined with the subsequent death, points toward a deeply troubling possibility: Bridget O'Connor may have been murdered, and her death was covered up as an accident. Sarah knows that proving such a claim would require substantial additional evidence, but the pattern emerging from the available facts is compelling. She decides to search for any legal records related to the case. In Massachusetts in the 1850s, even accidental deaths sometimes triggered coroner's inquests, especially if they occurred under circumstances that raised questions. The Hampshire County Courthouse maintains records dating back to the colonial era, though their organization leaves much to be desired. Sarah spends 3 full days in the courthouse archive room, a dusty windowless space in the basement, searching through boxes of handwritten documents. She finds estate settlements, property disputes, criminal proceedings for theft and assault, but nothing related to Bridget O'Connor's death. The absence of an inquest record is itself significant. In a society that prided itself on law and order, the death of a young woman under violent circumstances would typically warrant some official investigation, unless influential people had reasons to prevent such scrutiny. Sarah turns her attention to the Hannon family itself, seeking to understand what kind of people they were and what might have been happening in their household in the summer of 1858. She discovers that Thomas Hannon was known in the community as a stern but fair man, active in local agricultural societies and respected for his business acumen. His wife Catherine was involved in church activities and charitable work, considered a model of Christian virtue and domestic excellence. Their children attended the local school and were described in various documents as well-behaved and properly raised. On the surface, the Hannons appeared to embody the values of their time and place: hard work, religious devotion, family loyalty, and community responsibility. Yet Sarah has learned through years of historical research that public reputations often conceal private realities. The Victorian era, which was just beginning in 1858, was characterized by rigid social hierarchies, strict moral codes, and an obsessive concern with maintaining respectable appearances. Families went to great lengths to hide anything that might damage their standing in the community. Abuse, violence, alcoholism, mental illness, and other problems were kept behind closed doors and never discussed publicly. Sarah discovers another intriguing lead while reviewing property records. In April 1859, just 7 months after Bridget's death, Thomas Hannon sold the farm and moved his family to Ohio, where he purchased land and established a new farming operation. The sale happened quickly, and the price suggests he may have accepted less than market value in order to expedite the transaction. For a man who had spent years building up his property and reputation in Massachusetts, the sudden decision to relocate across hundreds of miles seems strange. Was he fleeing something? Did Bridget's death create tensions or suspicions in the community that made continued residents uncomfortable? Following the Hannon family to Ohio requires coordinating with historians at institutions there. Sarah contacts Dr. Rebecca Walsh at the Ohio Historical Society, explaining her research and requesting help tracking the family's life after they left Massachusetts. Rebecca is enthusiastic about the project and begins searching Ohio records for information about the Hannons. Within 2 weeks, she reports back with findings that add new dimensions to the story. The Hannon family settled in rural Ohio and re-established themselves as farmers, though they never achieved the same level of prosperity they had enjoyed in Massachusetts. Thomas Hannon died in 1874 at age 57, his death certificate listing the cause as heart failure. Catherine survived him by many years, dying in 1896 at age 74. Of their children, Thomas Jr. and William both became farmers. Margaret married a local merchant, and Elizabeth died young, at age 19, from tuberculosis. Rebecca finds no evidence that any member of the family ever returned to Massachusetts or maintained contact with their former community. Perhaps most significantly, Rebecca discovers that the Hannon family employed no live-in domestic servants after their move to Ohio. Census records from 1860 through 1880 list only family members in the household, with occasional references to day laborers hired during harvest seasons but not residing on the property. This represents a significant change from their Massachusetts arrangement, where having live-in servants was a mark of prosperity and social standing. The decision not to employ servants in their new home could reflect economic constraints, or it could indicate something darker, a deliberate choice to avoid situations that might lead to questions or problems. Sarah also seeks information about Mary Kelly, the other Irish servant who was living in the Hannon household according to the 1860 census. Tracing Mary proves more difficult than tracking the Hannons. She does not appear in the 1860 Massachusetts census taken in June, several months after the Hannons moved to Ohio, nor does Sarah find any record of her traveling with the family. Mary seems to have disappeared from the historical records sometime between the photograph in August 1858 and the census enumeration nearly 2 years later. Sarah searches marriage records, death records, and passenger lists for ships leaving Boston, but finds no trace of Mary Kelly, an unfortunately common name that makes definitive identification nearly impossible. The question of what happened to Mary haunts Sarah almost as much as Bridget's death. Was Mary present when Bridget died? Did she know what really happened? Did fear drive her away from the Hannon household, or did something happen to her as well? The silence in the historical records surrounding Mary's fate adds another layer of mystery and concern to the investigation. How many young women disappeared from history, their lives and deaths unrecorded, their stories lost because they lacked the social standing and family connections that ensured documentation and remembrance? As winter settles over Boston, Sarah has assembled a substantial body of evidence but still lacks the definitive proof that would confirm her suspicions about Bridget O'Connor's death. The photograph shows injuries to Bridget's neck 6 weeks before her death. Church and newspaper records confirm she died from injuries to her neck and head, officially ruled accidental. No official investigation occurred. The family left Massachusetts shortly afterward. The pattern is suggestive but not conclusive. Sarah knows she needs to find more direct evidence, something that reveals what actually happened in the Hannon household during that tragic summer and autumn of 1858. The breakthrough, when it comes, arrives from an unexpected source and transforms her investigation into something far more definitive and heartbreaking than she anticipated. December brings the first significant snowstorm of the season to Boston, covering the city in pristine white that muffles sound and transforms familiar streets into scenes from an older time. Sarah works through the holidays, declining invitations to family gatherings, driven by an obsession to uncover the full truth about Bridget O'Connor. The young woman's face in the photograph has become a constant presence in her thoughts, a silent witness demanding justice even across the vast gulf of more than 160 years. The breakthrough comes from a source Sarah had not previously considered: personal letters and diaries. While conducting a routine search through digital archives of historical societies across New England, Sarah discovers a reference to a collection donated to the Vermont Historical Society in 1983 by the descendants of Reverend Samuel Morrison, a congregational minister who served various parishes in Massachusetts and Vermont during the mid-19th century. The finding aid for the collection mentions that Morrison maintained detailed journals and correspondence, including letters received from parishioners and community members seeking spiritual counsel or assistance. Sarah immediately contacts the Vermont Historical Society, explaining her research and requesting access to the Morrison papers. The curator informs her that while the collection has been cataloged, it has not been digitized due to budget constraints. Sarah makes arrangements to visit Montpelier in early January, driving north through snow-covered landscapes that remind her of the world Bridget O'Connor would have known in her final months of life. The Vermont Historical Society occupies a historic building in the state capitol, and Sarah spends 3 days in their reading room, carefully working through boxes of Reverend Morrison's papers. His journals reveal him to have been a thoughtful, conscientious man who took his pastoral duties seriously and maintained detailed records of his interactions with parishioners. He served as pastor of the church near the Hannon farm from 1855 through 1860, meaning he would have known the family and been present at the time of Bridget's death. Morrison's journal entries from September 1858 contain references to the tragedy at the Hannon farm. On September 14th, he writes about conducting the funeral service for a young Irish servant girl who died in an unfortunate accident. His language is conventional and proper, expressing sympathy for the family and prayers for the deceased. However, Sarah notices something that makes her pause. Morrison notes that he prayed privately for guidance regarding matters of conscience related to this case, and that he felt troubled by questions he could not answer and obligations he could not fulfill. The cryptic nature of these comments suggests Morrison had concerns about the official explanation for Bridget's death but felt constrained from expressing them openly. 3 weeks later, Morrison's journal contains another significant entry. He records receiving a visitor late one evening, a young woman who came to the parsonage in great distress, seeking counsel and protection. Morrison does not name the visitor in his journal, maintaining confidentiality, but he describes her as a domestic servant who had recently left her employment under difficult circumstances and feared for her safety. She had knowledge of wrongdoing in the household where she had worked but did not know whether speaking about it would endanger her further or be believed by authorities. Morrison writes that he provided her with a small amount of money, letters of reference to help her find new employment, and advice to pray for wisdom and courage. Sarah's heart races as she reads this entry. Could the visitor have been Mary Kelly, the other servant from the Hannon household? The timing fits perfectly with Mary's disappearance from the historical record. If Mary witnessed or had knowledge of what really happened to Bridget, fleeing to seek help from the minister makes perfect sense. Morrison's decision not to name her in his journal shows his understanding of the risks she faced. The most significant discovery comes when Sarah examines Morrison's correspondence files. Filed carefully in a folder labeled Private Letters Received is a handwritten letter dated October 21, 1858. The letter isn't signed, but the handwriting is that of someone with limited education, the spelling irregular and the grammar uncertain. Sarah photographs each page with trembling hands, knowing she has found something extraordinary. The letter begins with an apology for troubling the Reverend and expresses gratitude for his kindness and assistance. The writer then pours out a story of terror and grief. She describes working in the Hannon household alongside her friend Bridget O'Connor, who came from the same parish in County Cork, Ireland. They had journeyed to America together, seeking better lives than the famine-stricken Ireland of their childhood could offer. They found employment with the Hannon family and initially felt fortunate, believing they had secured positions in a respectable household that would provide them with safety and decent treatment. The letter goes on to describe how things changed over time. Thomas Hannon, the patriarch, had periods of dark moods when he drank heavily and became volatile and violent. His wife Catherine lived in fear of these episodes and instructed the servants to stay out of his way when he was in such states. The writer describes multiple incidents when Hannon struck or shoved servants and family members during his rages, always followed by periods of remorse and promises to do better. The family never spoke of these incidents to anyone outside the household, maintaining the facade of respectability and piety that protected Hannon's reputation in the community. In the summer of 1858, according to the letter, Bridget caught Hannon's particular attention. He began making advances toward her that she rejected, trying to protect herself while remaining deferential enough not to provoke his anger. One evening in early August, Hannon cornered Bridget in the kitchen after the rest of the family had retired. A violent struggle ensued. He attempted to force himself on her, and when she fought back, he grabbed her by the throat and choked her until she lost consciousness. The writer of the letter, hearing the commotion, came into the kitchen and found Bridget unconscious on the floor, Hannon standing over her in a rage. Catherine Hannon appeared moments later and took control of the situation with cold efficiency. She ordered Hannon to his room, instructed the letter writer to help revive Bridget, and made it clear that if either servant spoke of what had happened, they would both be turned out without references, unable to find other employment, likely ending up destitute or worse. Catherine emphasized that no one would believe the word of Irish immigrant servants over that of a respectable family, and that making accusations would only result in their own ruin. She warned that Hannon's temper was dangerous and that provoking him further would put everyone in the household at risk. The letter describes the next 6 weeks as a time of mounting terror. Bridget recovered physically from the choking, though the bruises on her neck remained visible for weeks. Both young women lived in constant fear, sleeping together in the same room with furniture pushed against the door. They discussed running away but had no money, nowhere to go, and no way to support themselves without references from their employer. Catherine kept them under close watch, never leaving them alone with opportunities to seek help or make plans to escape. Then, on September 13th, the letter explains what really happened. Hannon, drunk and enraged about some trivial matter, pursued Bridget through the house. She fled toward the cellar, perhaps hoping to hide there or find an exit through the outside cellar door. Hannon caught her at the top of the cellar stairs. There was shouting, struggling. Then Bridget fell, tumbling down the steep wooden stairs, her body crashing against the stone walls and floor below. She was still alive when the letter writer reached her but severely injured, bleeding from her head, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. Catherine and Thomas Hannon came down into the cellar moments later. They sent the letter writer out of the cellar while they attended to Bridget, claiming they would summon the doctor. The letter describes how the doctor was not called until Bridget had been dead for several hours. By then, the scene in the cellar had been arranged to look like an accident. Catherine explained to the doctor that Bridget had gone down the cellar stairs to fetch preserves, missed her footing in the dim light, and fallen. The bruising on Bridget's neck from the August attack had faded enough that it could be dismissed as injuries from the fall itself. The doctor, a family friend who trusted the Hannons and had no reason to suspect foul play, certified the death as accidental. The matter was closed, and Bridget was buried quickly and quietly. The letter writer expresses overwhelming guilt for not having prevented Bridget's death, for not finding a way to get help despite the obstacles and threats. She describes fleeing the Hannon household the day after the funeral, unable to bear remaining there any longer, despite having no clear plan for her future. She made her way to Reverend Morrison, having heard that he was a good man who helped people in distress. She asks the Reverend what she should do with her knowledge of what happened to Bridget, whether she has a moral obligation to report the truth despite the certainty that no one would believe her accusations against a respected family. The letter concludes with heartbreaking simplicity. The writer says she knows that Bridget deserved better than to die so young and so violently, far from her family in Ireland, buried in an unmarked grave with her true story untold. She expresses hope that God will see justice done even if earthly authorities do not, and she asks the Reverend to pray for Bridget's soul and for her own, that they might both find peace despite the evil they encountered in the Hannon household. Sarah sits in the Vermont Historical Society reading room for a long time after reading this letter, tears streaming down her face. The terrible specificity of the account, the intimate knowledge of both Bridget's suffering and the household dynamics that enabled it, leaves no doubt in her mind that this letter was written by Mary Kelly. Here, finally, is the direct testimony she had sought, the voice of someone who witnessed the truth of what happened on the Hannon farm in 1858. The letter also provides context for Morrison's cryptic journal entries and his obvious discomfort with the situation. He knew the truth but faced an impossible dilemma. In the social and legal structures of the time, the testimony of an Irish immigrant servant woman would carry virtually no weight against a respected property-owning family. Pursuing accusations against Thomas Hannon would likely result in Mary being punished or persecuted while Hannon faced no consequences. Morrison chose to help Mary escape and start a new life rather than attempt a confrontation with the Hannon family that would accomplish nothing except placing Mary in danger. Sarah makes copies of the letter and Morrison's journal entries, following all proper archival protocols. On her drive back to Boston, she thinks about the impossible position Mary Kelly faced. Bridget O'Connor's death was, in the most technical sense, an accident. She did fall down the stairs. But the fall happened during a violent pursuit by an abusive employer who had previously attempted to rape her and had threatened her repeatedly. The entire context surrounding her death transforms it from a simple accident into something far more sinister, a homicide facilitated by a system that gave absolute power to employers over servants and that protected men of property and standing from accountability for their actions. Sarah also reflects on Catherine Hannon's role in the tragedy. Catherine was not a passive victim but an active participant in covering up her husband's violence and protecting the family's reputation at all costs. She chose social standing over truth and justice, demonstrating the complex ways women could be both oppressed by patriarchal systems and complicit in maintaining them. Catherine's calculated response to Bridget's injuries, her threats to silence the servants, and her orchestration of the cover-up following Bridget's death reveal a person willing to sacrifice vulnerable young women to preserve her family's position in society. With Mary Kelly's letter in hand, Sarah now has documentary evidence that fundamentally rewrites the story told by the photograph. What appeared to be a cheerful farm scene with nothing more than a mysterious mark in the background is now revealed as something much darker, evidence of ongoing abuse and violence that would culminate in a young woman's death. The photograph captures not a moment of prosperity and happiness but a moment of danger and suffering, visible to anyone who looks carefully enough at the shadows where the powerless existed. The winter months see Sarah transform her research into a comprehensive historical account of Bridget O'Connor's life and death. She writes an academic article for the Journal of American History, carefully documenting her findings and arguing that the case illuminates broader patterns of violence and exploitation in 19th-century domestic service. The article goes through peer review, with other historians examining her evidence and methodology. The consensus is clear. Sarah has made a significant historical discovery, recovering a story that was deliberately suppressed and nearly lost to time. The article's publication in early spring generates considerable attention. News outlets pick up the story, drawn by the dramatic elements of the photograph, the hidden testimony, and the questions about justice and accountability that resonate across the centuries. Sarah finds herself giving interviews, explaining her research methodology, discussing what Bridget's story reveals about American social history. She is careful to center Bridget and Mary in her telling, refusing to let the sensational aspects of the case overshadow the human tragedy at its core. Sarah also takes practical steps to ensure Bridget O'Connor is properly remembered. She contacts the current owners of the land where the town cemetery stands and works with them to identify the approximate location of the paupers section where Bridget was buried in 1858. With funding from the New England Heritage Institute and donations from individuals moved by Bridget's story, Sarah arranges for a memorial marker to be created and installed. The marker, made of enduring granite, bears a simple inscription: Bridget O'Connor, 1840 to 1858, immigrant from Ireland, victim of violence, her story finally told. The dedication ceremony for the memorial takes place on a bright May morning. Sarah has invited representatives from Irish American heritage organizations, domestic workers' rights groups, and the local historical society. About 70 people gather at the cemetery, a mix of historians, community members, and people who simply feel connected to Bridget's story. Sarah speaks about the importance of recovering lost voices from history, about the need to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the past rather than maintaining sanitized narratives that erase suffering and injustice. A representative from an Irish American Cultural Center reads a poem in both English and Irish Gaelic, honoring Bridget's memory and acknowledging the countless other immigrants whose stories were never told. A historian who specializes in domestic service gives remarks about the systemic vulnerabilities that made young women like Bridget and Mary so susceptible to exploitation and abuse. A minister offers prayers for Bridget's soul and for all those who died far from home, in difficult circumstances, without the comfort of family or adequate recognition of their worth and dignity. Sarah has arranged for musicians to play traditional Irish music during the ceremony, tunes that Bridget might have known from her childhood in County Cork. The haunting melodies drift across the cemetery grounds, momentarily connecting the present to the past, creating a space where the dead can be honored and remembered. Several attendees weep openly, moved by the ceremony and by the story of a life cut short by violence more than 160 years ago. After the dedication, Sarah continues her work to document Mary Kelly's fate. This proves to be a lengthy and difficult process. The letter Mary wrote to Reverend Morrison provides some clues about where she might have gone after leaving Massachusetts, but tracking a single Irish immigrant woman through the scattered records of the mid-19th century presents enormous challenges. Sarah works with genealogists and specialists in immigrant history, following lead after lead, most of which turn out to be dead ends. Finally, nearly a year after first discovering the photograph of the Hannon farm, Sarah finds a record that she believes with reasonable confidence identifies Mary Kelly. In the 1865 New York State Census, enumerated in Albany, a domestic servant named Mary Kelly appears in the household of a physician. Her age, place of birth, and year of arrival in America all match the Mary Kelly who worked for the Hannons. The 1870 census shows a Mary Kelly of the same age married to a carpenter named John Sullivan, living in Troy, New York, with 2 young children. Sarah finds marriage records confirming the union in 1867. Further research reveals that Mary Kelly Sullivan lived until 1908, dying at age 68 of pneumonia. She and John had 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. One of her daughters became a teacher, one of her sons became a union organizer in the textile mills. Mary's death certificate and obituary make no mention of her time working for the Hannons or the tragedy of Bridget O'Connor, suggesting she kept that chapter of her life private, perhaps sharing it only with her husband or taking the full story to her grave. Sarah is able to track down several of Mary's great-grandchildren, now elderly themselves but alive and interested in their family history. She contacts them carefully, explaining her research and asking if they know anything about their ancestors' early life in America. Most know only that Mary came from Ireland as a young woman and worked as a domestic servant before marrying. One great-granddaughter, now in her 80s and living in Connecticut, mentions that her mother told her Mary had witnessed something terrible when she was young, something that haunted her for the rest of her life, but that Mary refused to speak about it in detail, saying only that she had lost a dear friend in tragic circumstances. This second-hand testimony confirms what Sarah suspected. Mary Kelly carried the memory of Bridget O'Connor's death throughout her long life, unable to share the full truth of what happened but unable to forget it either. The trauma of witnessing violence, of being powerless to prevent tragedy, of being forced to remain silent about injustice left its mark across the decades. Even the eventual security and happiness Mary found in her marriage and family could not erase the ghost of what happened in the Hannon household in 1858. Sarah arranges to meet with Mary Kelly's descendants who are interested in learning more about this chapter of their family history. She shares copies of Mary's letter to Reverend Morrison, the historical documents she has gathered, and the photograph that started her investigation. The descendants are moved and troubled by the story, grateful to understand something about their ancestors' early life but disturbed by the violence and injustice Mary witnessed. Several express a desire to honor Bridget's memory, recognizing that their ancestors survived in part because Bridget did not, and that Mary's ability to escape and build a life came at the cost of her friend's death. Together, Sarah and Mary Kelly's descendants establish a small scholarship fund for young women from immigrant families pursuing higher education. They name it the Bridget O'Connor Memorial Scholarship, ensuring that Bridget's name will be associated not just with tragedy but with opportunity and hope for future generations. The scholarship will never undo the injustice of Bridget's death, but it creates something positive from the recovered story, transforming historical research into practical support for young women who face their own challenges and obstacles. Sarah's research also prompts broader discussions about historical memory and whose stories get told. She participates in conferences and public forums where historians debate how to present difficult aspects of the past without minimizing suffering or creating salacious narratives that exploit tragedy. Sarah argues that recovering stories like Bridget's is essential for understanding the full complexity of American history, including the ways systems of power protected abusers and silenced victims. She emphasizes that the goal is not to condemn everyone who lived in earlier eras but to acknowledge truth and ensure that those who were ignored or erased in their own time receive recognition and respect in ours. The photograph itself becomes part of a traveling exhibition on domestic service in 19th century America, with extensive contextual information about Bridget O'Connor's story. Museum visitors can see the image that looks so cheerful at first glance, then read the detailed explanation of what research revealed about the mark on the young woman's neck in the background. The exhibition includes Mary Kelly's letter, with her words displayed on the wall so visitors can read her testimony directly rather than receiving it filtered through modern interpretation. The exhibition proves remarkably popular and emotionally powerful. Many visitors report being moved to tears by Bridget and Mary's story. Some share their own family histories of immigrant ancestors who worked as domestic servants under difficult conditions. Others reflect on contemporary parallels, drawing connections between the exploitation of vulnerable workers in the past and present. The exhibition succeeds in making history personal and relevant, showing how individual stories illuminate larger patterns and help us understand systemic issues that persist across time. Sarah receives numerous letters and emails from people who have seen the exhibition or read articles about her research. Many thank her for recovering Bridget's story and giving her a voice after so many years of silence. Some share similar stories from their own family histories, accounts of ancestors who suffered abuse or violence that was covered up or ignored. A recurring theme in these communications is gratitude that someone took the time and effort to look beyond surface appearances, to investigate what was hidden in the shadows of an old photograph, to insist that the lives of poor and powerless people matter enough to be studied and remembered. As the second anniversary of Sarah's discovery of the photograph approaches, she returns to her office at the New England Heritage Institute and looks again at the image that changed the course of her work and gave meaning to countless hours of research. She can see it with different eyes now, understanding what was visible all along to anyone who looked carefully enough. The cheerful farm scene is still there, but so is the evidence of suffering and injustice. The family posed proudly in the foreground remains, but now Bridget O'Connor in the background is not invisible or insignificant but central to the story the photograph tells. Sarah thinks about how history is constructed, how easily certain people and perspectives get excluded from the official narrative, how much effort is required to recover what has been lost or hidden. She reflects on the responsibility historians have to seek out uncomfortable truths rather than accepting comfortable myths. She considers the ethical dimensions of her work, the ways historical research can serve justice even when legal justice is no longer possible, the importance of acknowledgement and remembrance as forms of restitution for past wrongs. The photograph remains pinned to Sarah's office wall, a reminder of what can be discovered when historians look carefully at sources, ask probing questions, and refuse to accept official explanations that exclude or diminish certain voices. Bridget O'Connor's story, lost for more than a century and a half, has been recovered and told. Her life, which ended so tragically at age 18, has been documented and honored. Her name, which appeared only briefly in official records before being forgotten, is now known to thousands of people who have encountered her story through Sarah's research. Sarah knows that other photographs contain other hidden stories waiting to be discovered. Countless archives hold documents that could reveal truths about exploitation, violence, resistance, and survival if examined with care and insight. The past is not dead and buried but alive in the evidence that remains, demanding attention from those willing to do the difficult work of investigation and interpretation. Bridget O'Connor's photograph, with its cheerful surface and its dark secrets, stands as testament to both the horrors that history conceals and the possibility that truth can be recovered through persistent, compassionate scholarship. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, Sarah looks out her office window at the Charles River flowing past, thinking about all the lives that have passed through this landscape over centuries, about all the stories told and untold. She returns to her computer and begins outlining her next research project, already pursuing leads on other mysterious photographs and unexplained deaths in the historical record. The work continues, driven by the conviction that everyone deserves to be remembered, that every voice matters, that history belongs to all people, not just those with power and privilege. Bridget O'Connor's story is complete now, or as complete as it can be given the limitations of historical evidence. But her story has also become part of a larger narrative about recovering lost voices, about challenging official histories, about recognizing the humanity and worth of people whose suffering was dismissed or ignored in their own time. The photograph that captured her image in August 1858, showing the mark of violence on her neck, has become a powerful historical document, evidence not just of one crime but of systemic failures that enabled abuse and silenced victims. And through Sarah's research, through the memorial in the cemetery, through the scholarship bearing Bridget's name, through the exhibition and articles and conversations her story has generated, Bridget O'Connor has received something that was denied to her in life: acknowledgement, respect, and the assurance that her existence mattered and will be remembered,